Epilogue, Chapter 31. This world is ours now. As time passed, the world began to heal. It rained often, and the weather was gradually becoming colder. 3 weeks after the final defeat of the fabrication machine, the Stitchpunk Coven was having a pleasant evening outside the courtyard. The bright golden sunlight was just barely filtering through the dark. Thick gray clouds as it was sent behind the distant mountains. The clouds above nearly promising an evening shower. However, at the moment, the twins were playfully chasing one another across the paths and bridges, eventually getting 6 and 8 and 7 to partake in their game. The air was filled with shouts and laughter and bright flashes as the twins laugh in their own way. 2 was watching, laughing heartily at the young Stitchpunks playing. Walking across the courtyard, the 2 others were 5 and 9. 9's injuries had completely healed. He no longer limped, and the pain in his body had completely disappeared. The only remnants of the injuries were the scars on his body. 9 had never felt happier. His heart soared as he watched his family playing, reveling in their freedom. Each smile 9 made him all the more joyful. This is what he had been waiting for his entire life, and this was a beautiful moment. A beautiful future. For a moment, the 2 male ragdolls paused, just watching their companions play, for the pure joy of it. 5 began to hum a nonchalant tune, swaying back and forth. 9 joined in, trying to match the harmony. However, both boys ended up in a completely different song and dissolved into happy laughter in their silliness. Behind them, there was a shuffling sound, and 9 and 5 turned to see 1 walking towards them, rubbing the back of his neck jadedly. 9 couldn't help but notice that 1 was walking oddly. He was stiff and off balance. Usually the older male held himself with regality. Now he looked old and careworn, his crimson cape shredded and hanging limply around his shoulders. Oh, damned, he muttered to himself in irritation, stumbling and finally being able to sit down upon the empty, deep green bottle. He dropped his head into his hands, sighing. Are you okay? 9 asked him, quirking a questioning brow. 1 nodded and rubbing his forehead with his metal knuckles. No, I'll manage. Just getting a bit old, that's all. 1 stammered, waving a reassuring hand at the 2 young men. 9 glanced at 5 and shrugged. The 2 of them turned away and headed towards their friends, leaving 1 behind. 9. Wait, he said from behind them, and 9 and 5 turned around and seeing him looked anxious up at the young ragdoll. Can I have a word with you? 1 asked suddenly. 9 and 5 shared a glance before 9 tilted his chin in the direction of the others. 5 nodded in understanding, turning away and heading for the others, leaving 1 and 9 to speak alone. 9 turned to 1 with a small smile, the older man patting the space next to him as he sat. 1's eyes caught sight of the long, jaded scar on 9's side and grimaced and sighed. I've been a bitter old pill, haven't I? 1 said to him as the younger sat down. When he didn't answer, he said, No, much worse than that, I fear. You are right. I've seen clearer now what horrible things I've done. He took a breath and continued. 9 watched in awe. 1 looked at him as if begging forgiveness. I'm sorry. I lost sight of everything, he said, bowing his head in shame, looking down at the dusty ground beneath him. 9 looked down at it as well, trying to find what to say to the elder. However, before he had a chance to speak, one continued, looking ahead at the rest of the coven. 9, I cannot fathom my appreciation for your creation. I cast you off as a curse that plagued our clan. I was so very wrong. So very blind to the truth. I had been frightened by the machines for so long that I closed myself off from the world we were meant to protect. For 11 years I kept everyone locked away, forgetting those who needed my protection the most. It took me so long to realize that you were the one meant to bring us back together, willing to give your life to do so. Your bravery, young man, is what truly saved us and helped me discover the family I had all along. And I hope that in time you will come to forgive me and realize that you helped me finally see the light. One finished softly, looking down at his clasping hands. 9 watched one for a moment, staring at him in disbelief. He dropped his gaze for a moment, thinking of his next words. Look, we've both made mistakes. What's past is past. But now we can learn from them. Learn to finally be a family. 9 put a comforting hand on one's shoulder, smiling softly. Perhaps some good came from this. It's brought us all together. One looked at 9, then smiled softly at the young man, knowing that the boy was now his friend, and nothing was going to change that. Now, let's go join the others, 9 said, getting to his feet and offering his hand to 1. He placed his hand inside of the younger Stitchpunk's, and he helped him to his feet. Before releasing his hand, the older man gave 9 a gentle squeeze, affirming their friendship and accepting 9's forgiveness. 1 then tiredly ran his hand over his head, making his ponytail-like knot bounce back up. 9 looked at the knot, hesitated, then couldn't help but chuckle. 1 glanced up at him and immediately cleared his throat in embarrassment. 1 then glanced up at the knot and laughed as well with 9. The two then walked over at the others. The twins spotted 9 and immediately raced for him. The older Stitchpunk opened his arms, smiling widely. The boys leaped into his arms, bringing 9 to the cobbled ground, laughing. As the 3 and 4 trying to wrestle 9 to the ground. 1 walked over where 2 was sitting. He sat beside his fellow elder. The inventor looked up at the older man, and the two shared a soft smile. They were finally friends once again. Sitting on the edge of the bridge were 9 and 7, watching 9 play with the twins, blowing raspberries into their bellies and pulling their hoods over their heads. 7 then reached up and placed her hand on 5's shoulder. He looked up at her in a question. Thank you, she said softly. 5 grinned widely, reaching up and squeezed her hand. She then pushed against his arm, playfully leaping from the bridge, tucking into a somersault and landing gracefully on the ground below. She called back to 5. Keep up! He gave a grin and got to his feet, running down the bridge. As soon as the twins saw 5 and 7, they ran beside 9, looking at him for protection from getting caught by the 2 older Stitchpunks. With a laugh, 9 turned, and 3 tried to dodge the 2. Laughter filled the air as 6 and 8 joined the game. They ran around the courtyard, chasing one another and feeling happier than they had. 7 eventually caught 3 in her arms, tickling his sides and twirling him around as he giggled uncontrollably. 5 round the corner of the bridge and crashed into 9. Both young men toppled to the cobbled ground, their wide and joyful laughter echoing in the courtyard. They then leapt from the other in their hands, locking around the other's arms, trying to wrestle the other to the ground. Grunts and hoots of joy were heard as the brothers tussled. 5 was slightly heavier of the 2 and soon brought 9 to the ground. The 2 boys laughed hysterically as 5 pinned 9 to the ground. The younger of the two tried to writhe his way from his elder brother and push him off. Forrest suddenly came around the corner as he saw the two older ragdolls were whirling around and tried to run away. 9 and 5, however, were too quick for the little Stitch punk. They seized his arms and pulled him back towards them, tickling his sides and making him squirm as he laughed silently, his eyes flashing with excitement. His brothers joined in his laughter as they all caught to their feet. 9 heaving 4 up onto his shoulders and holding his hands. They walked out from underneath the bridge and looked over the others, seeing 3 trying to capture 6, the 2 darting around each other. 4 scrambled down from 9's shoulders and ran to join his brother in catching the seer. 9's grin was wide and warm as he watched them, and he looked upon 7. He couldn't help but sigh softly. He felt like the luckiest man in the world. Right then, after all, he had his family back. He belonged to the woman he loved. His brother was standing right beside him. He had been granted a second chance, and his world was at peace. Nothing could be better. Suddenly, 2 wide, large hands snatched him around the middle and lifted him from the ground. Before 9 knew it, 8 had slung him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The large ragdoll carried him across the courtyard. 9 looked over his shoulder to 8 in question, about to ask why the guardian suddenly felt the need to pick him up. Finally, 8 picked him back off his broad shoulders and set him on the ground directly in front of 7. She gave a small noise of surprise as 9 suddenly appeared in front of her. 9 blinked and gave a nervous laugh, glancing up at 8. He winked slyly before turning and picking 3 up, giving the younger boy a ride on his shoulders. 9 looked back at 7, smiling tenderly at his. She smiled back, adoring 9's crooked smile. Reaching forward, she tapped the tip of his optic with an index finger. "Keep up!" With a shout of elation, 9 reached forward and tried to grab 7 around her middle. She easily dodged and ran out of his reach, sprinting away from him. He ran right after her, his heart pounding with an excitement coursing through him. A thrill he nearly couldn't explain, but being up to his feet once more, having fun with his friends, people that he loved, knowing they were all here to stay with one another, made his very soul grow brighter. It wasn't long before 9 was able to scoop 7 in his arms. She gave a shriek as he lifted her off her feet and twirled her around in the air. He took her into his embrace, giving a breathless laugh. When he lowered her to the ground, she kept her arms around his shoulder as they looked into each other's eyes, both wearing wide smiles. Together they leaned forward and touched the tip of their optics to the others, sharing a tender moment. 9 vaguely wondered, however, he came to be so blessed that she came into his life, that he belonged to this gorgeous creature, strong being, courageous, strong being. Closing his eyes, 9 knew that in these moments, his life was perfect. Absolutely perfect. A little ways away, 5 was watching the tender scene, smiling widely. Finally, the ragdolls he called his best friends realized that they were meant for each other, and their happiness was contagious. All the one-eyed healer knew was that there was a bright future ahead for all of them. Then, a huge crack of thunder rolled across the sky, strong enough to shake the ground. The Stitchpunks looked up to see a white bolt of lightning dance across the dark clouds. The storm had arrived and was building in the sky quickly. The clan turned and began to walk towards the porch, heading in for the night. 9, however, paused while the others walked away. He looked to the ground, then bent down on one knee. Opening his chest, he reached inside and pulled something out before zipping himself back up. 7 and 5 walked back towards him, looking at him in curiosity as he stooped down. 9 opened his fingers, and in the palm was a shard of the talisman. With his other hand, he dug a small hole in the earth, placing the shard gently into the hole, and covered it up with dirt. With it, he buried the nightmare that was finally over. The only thing ahead was their future together as a family. As the three Stitch Punks stood, Nine looked to his two best friends, his expression soft. I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you. He spoke softly. 9 and 7 smiled widely at him. We won it together. You saved us, 9. 5 said with a smile, looking to his family. 9 looked at them as well. He then reached up and put his arm around both his best friend's shoulders, holding them closely in those moments he couldn't ask, hope, or pray for more. In those moments, the world was just as it should be. For him, the world was perfect. The three Stitch Punks began to walk back and forth in the house. 9 taking 7's hand, suddenly something drifted past his vision. He blinked and paused for looking around in wonder. The air around them was suddenly dotted with small white flakes, specks drifting down sincerely and dancing in the wind. 9 reached up to the sky, opening his fingers as he brought down his hand, and saw he held a soft patterned crystalline speck, a snowflake. The flake quickly melted. But many more were to follow in the sleet. 9 smiled up at the sky, blinking as the snow fell upon him. He closed his eyes, letting them touch his cheeks. The world was finally healing, just as the Stitch Punks were. Everything was changing for the better, and he simply couldn't wait. The others approached, watching the snow fall with awe. 9 opened his eyes, and he immediately spotted a flicker. Then a strange green light appeared in the mist. The coven watched in confusion and slight fear as the light approached them slowly. 9's brows furrowed as he studied the light. The wisp was tall as he continued to walk forward. It was nothing to be feared, but it neared the ragdolls. The shape became more well-defined. Glistening particles surrounded the light underneath it, transformed into a familiar being. It was a human soul. As it stopped before the clan, their eyes all widened and their jaws dropped in disbelief. The soul was an old man named Julius, with a long, ragged, wrinkled face and soft, wrinkled eyes underneath bushy eyebrows. His hair struck out all in directions, and was dressed in a long, flowing robe that billowed delicately around him. In the wind, he was smiling softly as he approached the Stitch Punks. It was the scientist. 9 stared at the soul, awestruck. He simply couldn't believe it. A fragment so small, but still there, of the scientist's soul had managed to make it into the land beyond. It was the scientist who looked after him when he was gone. He had given him the choice to stay, who had sent him back. The Stitch Punk clan stood closely together, unable to take their eyes from the soul of their creator. As the scientist approached the 9, he looked at each Stitch Punk, studying their face closely. He came to stand in front of one, his first creation. The two men looked at one another for a moment before one dropped his gaze in shame. His creator had seen all he had done and all the mistakes he made. Reaching forward, the scientist placed a finger underneath one's chin and tilted his head up. Looking into his eyes, there was something on the soul's face that made the elder Stitch Punk smile. Forgiveness. The scientist nodded proudly, placing a hand on one's shoulder, and the old Stitch Punk silently mouthed the words, "Thank you." The scientist then walked to 2, greeting him like an old friend. He placed his hand on the adventurer's shoulder tenderly. 2 grinned widely at his creator, reaching up and placing his hand over the human's. The scientist patted his shoulders, then looked down at the twins. They beamed up at him, and he laughed silently, reaching forward and ruffling their hoods playfully. They silently giggled, smiling widely up at their creator, as they had always loved him. The scientist looked to Six then, nodding at him proudly. He grinned, looking down sheepishly. The soul patted the striped soothsayer's shoulder, letting him know how proud he was that Six had led his coven in the right direction. He looked at 8, and the two shared a soft smile. The scientist then looked at 5. The healer was grinning widely, overjoyed to see his creator one last time. The soul reached forward, taking 5's hand in his own and squeezing gently, very proud of his mechanic. 5 beamed then. The human finally turned to 9 and 7, looking at the two young Stitchpunks with a soft smile. His eyes trailed down to their intertwined hands, then back up to them. He wore a sly smile before laughing gently. Though silently, 9 and 7 both beamed glances at one another in joy. The scientist smiled at them, nodding his approval. Reaching up, he lay a hand on 7's cheek, gently brushing her face with his thumb. The warrior reached up and covered his hand with her own and smiled softly. Finally, the scientist turned to his final creation. The two had never met, but Julius knew all about the young man that had the last piece of his soul. 9 smiled at his creator, finally meeting the man that thought he never would. The scientist he thought he never would. The scientist reached down and took 9's free hand, holding it tightly. Everything they ever wanted to say to one another was conveyed in one look. 9 knew that Julius forgave him and was proud of him for his bravery and sacrifice. Then he reached up into his robe, bringing out something clenching in his wrinkled hand. He held out his hand to 9, looking as if he wanted to give the young man something. 9 opened his hand, and the scientist gently placed something in his palm, closing 9's fingers around it. The two shared one final smile, knowing that this was goodbye. The scientist then stepped back, looking at all of his creations together. He smiled softly, obviously overjoyed to see them all together, standing as one. Finally, the family they were meant to be. The scientist then closed his eyes and became no more than a wisp of bright green light. It left the ground, then circled the ragdoll coven once. The soul then lifted into the sky, finally dissipating into the dark clouds and snow. They looked on in awe as their creator went back to the place he belonged. 9 smiled after him, then looked down and opened his fingers. The scientist had gifted him with a small piece of parchment, burnt at the edges. He studied it carefully, seeing that there was small letters on it. Hope. 9 smiled softly and closed his fingers around the ember. He looked to the sky, watching the world around him heal. Not only the earth, but his family as well. Their journey had been a long one. Their mission tested of strength, and yet they were 9 ragdolls who had been entrusted with the protection of the future, finally succeeding in their mission. They finally became a family. There was nothing but a bright future ahead. Together, for now, the 9 stood in their perfect moment forever. Not too far away from where they stood, something was growing up slowly through the moist soil. It was a tiny plant, bright green and surrounded by a tendril of dark green grass. It was growing bright above the shard of the talisman. The tiny flakes of snow dropped softly on the leaves of the plant. As they did so, the flakes seemed to release something from their crystalline depths. minuscule fragments of bright green souls. One day, they would be ready to return. What happens now? The young woman asked. I think we will do what fate needs us to. He answered kindly. For now, the future is ours, and we will protect it. The snow fell tranquilly and serenely in the country that night. For now, everything was silent, watching their protectors heal and become who they were meant to be. The future was nothing but full of hope and waiting for those ready to live it. End of Epilogue, and the end of 9 The Savior Returns.